Hey, welcome to Kotlin Conversations, where we're having conversations with just some of the amazing speakers here at Kotlin Conf 2023. My name is Huyen Tuet Dao, and I am speaking with...
Hi, this is Amanda Hinchman Dominguez.
So Amanda, really excited. Thank you for taking time. Actually, we both were speaking at the same time, so I regretfully missed your talk. But for folks that aren't as familiar with you, can you let us know kind of what you do, where you're based?
Yeah. Sure, yeah. So I am an Android engineer at Adyen, and I'm also a Kotlin GDE, and I am based in Chicago, and I guess I'm a book author as well. Yeah.
So that's a lot of really awesome Kotlin credentials, but let's kind of go back a little bit. Where did you actually get started with Kotlin? Yeah,
that's a really good place to start. So I actually started out as a web developer. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I was that interested in tech at that point. It was kind of a scrappy startup situation. And frankly, I was not a fan. I was like, I don't know if I like doing this. But I was in Florida at the time, so it's also not exactly a tech community. And I kind of got into it because I was playing around with JavaFX, and someone on Twitter was like, hey, there's a similar version that's a lot easier, a lot less words. And I'm like, oh, there's this Tornado FX. So Tornado FX was how I got into it. Yeah. And then it's a lightweight Kotlin framework that leverages JavaFX. So that's kind of how I fell into it. And I got onto the Slack chat, and there was just these super nice people. You ask a question, and then like 5 people go in to answer immediately.
That's not always the case in tech communities.
No.
So yeah. so that's part of like what drew you into the community. So,
yeah.
But now you are very much a part of the community with organizing.
Yeah.
And also being a GDE. Like how, I guess, is that what inspired you mostly, the community to kind of join in and kind of participate in that? So.
Yeah, actually, after that whole, the Kotlin Link Slack bit, I decided to move to Chicago because this was like years ago when Kotlin wasn't as popular and there weren't a lot of jobs. Actually, when I told someone, I'm going to move to Chicago because I heard there was a little Kotlin scene, it was like 16 people at the time. And they like laughed. They're like, yeah, Kotlin's never going to be, I know, look at us now. Can you believe it?
No, that's awesome.
I literally went to Chicago and I started Ruby on Rails. And because I knew Kotlin, I actually got into Android that way. People were like, oh, we can't find any Android engineers. But Kotlin? I'm like, I do know Kotlin. And I haven't turned back since. I've been doing Android, and it's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
That's awesome. And obviously, super involved still. And what I think is really cool, so just to give a little bit of a kind of spoiler or kind of give the reason why Amanda's here, you were actually giving a talk on a subject that really intimidates me and perhaps intimidates a lot of people, and that's actually the compiler.
Yes.
So you kind of led us through your journey of like starting from web and then getting to Android. I'm an Android dev, so yay.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. We have Amanda. But I feel like that's not. I feel like most the day-to-day life of most Android developers is just Android development.
It's just Android development.
And the compiler feels like some level above that. Can you maybe just how did you get into working with a compiler and actually kind of getting in there?
Oh, it's all quite by accident. So all that Tornado FX stuff.
Yeah.
I still live by this one. I think it was so far ahead of its time. Sometimes I think Compose is just trying. I asked the Compose team actually. I was like, hey, have you guys heard of Tornado FX? They're like, no. I'm like, no, really? Because you guys kind of do this. It's declarative. They have like special like dependency injection stuff, and there's I don't know, there's a lot of parallels. Mm-hmm. But so I started looking into the source code, and I'm like, what is all this? Like, it's all this metaprogramming stuff.
Yeah.
So I started messing around with metaprogramming, and metaprogramming is kind of the gateway drug to compilers.
Okay.
Because you start trying to do metaprogramming. I was actually trying to write out automated UI, generated automated UI testing using metaprogramming. You can't really do it that way. I tried. So I found AST parsing, abstract syntax trees, which turns out is a part of the compiler. And later on, I actually kind of did a little bit of a pivot where I wasn't doing just Android. I was working on the Arameta SDK because I guess they ran into some similar problems with parsing. I didn't realize that this had to do with compilers at the time, but I was like, oh, well, let me know if you solve this problem, and then I ended up doing it. So metaprogramming is the gateway drug to compiler work. Maybe not the best phrase.
So for folks like me who have absolutely never kind of entered this kind of like this realm, can you maybe just give a quick, like, I don't know, elevator pitch, or maybe just explainer on, okay, what's metaprogramming, and maybe like how that might connect to, getting into compiler and writing compiler plugins?
Of course. So metaprogramming, the basic idea is that it is code writing code. And there are different language features that every language offers. So common ones might be like AOP, like annotation-based processing. Oh gosh, I'm like kind of like missing out on some of those other ones. And there's more obvious forms like just straight up code generating code, stuff like that. But sometimes you want to do something that the language just does not offer. So that's when you are more likely to get into compiler stuff, because maybe you want to write a plugin to alter the default behavior a little bit. And in order to do that, you kind of have to understand the compiler. And that is a bit of a challenge. As I kind of mentioned in my talks, the current documentation, well, there's not a lot to speak of.
I've heard that's kind of like part of the learning curve, is that the documentation is not there. So.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the, like, depending on where folks are working, even at JetBrains, like maybe someone's working on the front end, but they don't know the back end.
Sure, yeah.
I can't say that I know all of it either. It's so big. But it's, if you want to get into compiler work, I mean, it's not just writing plugins. I think it turns out all those leak code questions that we do, like, we're like, why are we learning about all this? So all those problems actually exist within the compiler.
So like red and black trees and flip, all that.
Turing stuff,
that stuff.
Yeah, it turns out it all has to do with the compiler.
Is that just because that you're working at such a kind of like fundamental, like lower level, that stuff starts coming back into play? All right, good to know.
So it turns out there was a reason for all of that, but most of us are not doing compiler work, but it is computational thinking. It does make you a better programmer over time.
So, I mean, I think given that compiler just sounds intimidating in general. I took a class in college.
It is intimidating.
It is really intimidating. And then, of course, adding on kind of more of this computational thinking. Would you still say that, if someone was interested, even if they say didn't feel comfortable with any of these concepts or just didn't feel like they had the experience, do you think it's viable for anyone to kind of start working in metaprogramming and with the compiler? Do you think it's something that anyone can do?
Yes, I do think this is possible. But the key to that is learning in a social setting. So computational thinking, especially for something where, there's not a lot of documentation, this stuff kind of is like very like, you have to take you don't have to take a lot of education, but you got to learn a lot about it. And it's just kind of a hard concept. Learning about it in a social setting, I feel like, is the only way, because you kind of go in and you get dropped in and you're just lost.
But as a group, then you can trial and error, you can combine learning, combine knowledge, and kind of figure things out together, rather than looking at what documentation there is and struggling and possibly giving up. Is that that was pretty key for you, obviously?
It was, I'll be honest, it was a lot of poking and prodding for me for a long time. And it was fun because there were some people like on this Kotlin link Slack that was like, well, I know a little scripting, or, oh, I know a little bit about graphs. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like maybe we can combine that with trying to figure out, like when I was doing the AST parsing, I would run it. It would crash, and I'm like, okay, what is this? And I would add a new definition. It was poking and prodding. And then over time, we started like combining our notes together. And in this way, I think it is feasible to learn more about metaprogramming in this way. Like, there's academic papers you can always go to. But I do think the best way is to start really, really, really small, like one little case, and then start highlighting, like maybe look at other compiler plugins. I lifted the hood for Compose. Like that was a really good use case because Jetpack Compose uses compiler plugins to change all that behavior.
So is there actually, you mentioned Kotlin Lang, which is an amazing Slack. Is there like a little compiler collective or metaprogramming collective on Kotlin Lang?
So I don't know about metaprogramming, but there is a compiler channel where lots of other folks are trying, like, hey, I'm trying to write this plugin and I'm just trying to figure out like why is this, so yeah, there is a channel for that. Also, I believe there's Android study group that's not as accessible, but I think there's like a WTF Compose channel.
And obviously they probably get into compiler stuff then because of the nature of Compose.
Yeah. So yeah, I would say like lately I've been looking a lot in the Compose channel, but also surprisingly Tornado FX, like even though it's just a basic Java desktop application, the nice thing is it's so easy to spin up that there's been a lot of people with real use cases with it, and it's like scientists or people who have a lot of data to crunch, but they're not programmers. And I think a lot of people end up eventually like, oh, but I really want to do this, and then they just kind of fell into compiler.
So that's interesting then. So you're finding the community is not necessarily one particular swath of like, one particular domain or industry that kind of like everybody at some point finds the need to poke around. Okay,
Yeah.
So at some point when you do Kotlin long enough, I feel like there's some pop culture reference I could make there. But that of course we all have our specific needs, and if the language as it is now is not meeting it, you can kind of start like...
Yeah. That's a dangerous, well, I don't know if it's dangerous. I mean, I think people are starting, they're like, wait, you can do whatever you want? I'm like, yes.
Okay, so since you know a little bit more about compiler than I do, and there's obviously a lot of news and happenings, currently with like the updates to the Kotlin compiler. We heard a little bit about it this morning on the keynote. And of course, all the wonderful announcements we've had about like IR and things like that. Is there something that, as someone who has kind of seen behind the curtain, like looked into the matrix, is there anything that, that you think maybe an more average dev or less compiler savvy dev might want to pay attention to? Or do you think that either from an interest standpoint that, hey, this is really cool, this will make our lives better, or something that, might be something that would be something that, what's exciting to you about what's happening now with
with some of the changes for the Kotlin
and
compiler?
Does that impact what you're doing and what you're learning?
Yes. I mean, in terms of the research itself, it definitely adds some complications. Like, one easy example was it took me 3 months to understand that, there's all this in the source code. I think it says like, here are some classes, but there's like duplicate ones, and one is like FE10, the other is FIR. I'm like, apparently that's K1 and K2.
Okay.
I had no idea. So naming conventions are a little tough, but. Let's talk about some of the new changes, I guess. I mean, not to reiterate on some of that stuff, but it does, like some of those, even though we don't think a lot of that stuff does apply to us, it does. Like, it actually affects our day-to-day work. I think when we were using Kotlin 4 or 5 years ago, I know we're kind of complaining about slower loading.
Yeah, common complaint,
Yeah, all of that. So kind of interesting, IntelliJ runs, like all of that is IDE plugins, which come from, a portion of the Kotlin compiler. So some of that new K2 stuff with the FIR or front end intermediate representation, all of that work was done to make IntelliJ faster. Well, that wasn't the explicit reason.
I've heard that.
That
I'm going
is
to get
one
a
side
faster
effect.
ID soon. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So a lot of that, like there's a lot of heavy details around that, but I think the long and short of it is that on an immediate basis, we're all benefiting from faster IntelliJ experiences. And also like Compose too. Compose has started making huge waves. It's changed the way that we do kind of like a UI development in Android. We're now even going to multi-platform, but we were not able to do any of that without having to change the default behavior, and actually it accelerated some of those performance optimizations. It's been interesting because I feel like ever since Kotlin and Android started going together, it's almost like a marriage in a way, you know? Because, you know, like first it's we start talking about memory leaks more because remember the whole coroutines thing, just you can spin off as many as you want, and then at some point Ron's like, wait.
Not actually.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting seeing how like Android and Kotlin has started really like forcing each other to start like accelerating faster, be more performant. I think it's kind of a nice relationship.
So I want to dig more, but you gave I wasn't there because I was giving a talk at the same time. But I know it was an amazing talk, which is literally a crash course on the compiler. So I don't want to spoil any of that. You need to go see Amanda's talk. So I will just leave that at that. And obviously, you know so much about the compiler. You are also an author, is that right?
Yes. You know how everyone does like, I made bread in pandemic. I was like, I decided to write a book in pandemic.
So it's your pandemic book.
That's my pandemic book.
Instead of a sourdough, you went and wrote a technical book.
That's what it, you know, we all have our, I'm never going to write another book in my 20s again.
I've heard that. That doesn't sound surprising to me, but
yeah, it was a pandemic book. But it was a book that I co-wrote, and it's called Programming Android with Kotlin, Achieving Structured Concurrency with Coroutines. Very long title.
Long title, good content though. As like obviously those concepts are even more kind of integrated with Android now.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Because concurrency is hard. And so definitely if any of those words appeal to you, check out Amanda's book.
And you don't even have to be like an Android person to enjoy the book. That's the nice thing. It's only 300 pages. You can read it out of order. 5 of those chapters are dedicated to current Java threading options and Android threading options, and then there's Kotlin options offered for concurrency. And then it talks about how Kotlin is able to solve a lot of those issues that used to be present with some of the older threading options. So it's a lot about, it's a build up to structured concurrency, but there's a lot on just building a solid foundation on threading and parallelism and
all that good stuff.
All that good stuff.
Definitely check out both Amanda's talk and her book. Amanda, if people wanted to find you on the internet, where can they do that?
Oh, well, I'm hanging out on Mastodon. I still have a Twitter account, but I don't post on it. So I'm on Mastodon. I'm sort of on Twitter, but not really. I'm on Slack. And you can also find me literally in Chicago. I co-host the Chicago user group, and that's been a lot of fun too. We've started doing it in person again, and we've been hanging out at different tech offices in the city. We just did one at Grindr recently. Oh. Yeah, and we got one at Grubhub next week maybe.
Yeah, so if you're in Chicago and you're interested in Kotlin, Amanda is who you should talk to. Well, Amanda, I know it's like a busy day and you're ready to decompress after the talk, but thanks so much for stopping by and talking to us. I definitely am going to be tapping into your compiler knowledge at some point.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great time. And so we will see you all later, and definitely, again, check out Amanda's talk and her book, and we'll see you real soon.
See you.